All right, guys, let's get started here. So, last time we talked, we got into the conversation of depression a little bit. And what we were talking about last time was using depression as a way to begin to describe, in a sense, two different ways of thinking in Chinese medicine. Basically, what I mean is that we usually are just kind of stuck just going around saying, like, oh, depression is always liver qi stagnation, right? So we jump straight to the pattern diagnosis. But I think a useful thing here is kind of the way I was sort of taught to think in Chinese medicine about everything, which is to have a descriptor of the actual experience, right? So, what we're saying here is that the actual description of the experience of depression is this lack of the clear yang of the spleen from it's not rising into the mind to create clear thinking, realistic thinking, right? So this isn't necessarily, when the clear yang reaches the mind, it's not a preponderance of joy where you're just, oh my God, I'm so blissed out or something like that. It's not this overjoyed situation. It's a general kind of satisfaction. It's an outlook that is positive. It's an outlook that moves forward. It's an outlook that has some element of wanting to nurture and help others, and or whatever the case may be. It's this generally positive outlook on life. We could generally say that. And you can get into viewpoints of Buddhism or viewpoints of Taoism, and these kind of traditional thought processes that play into the thinking processes of Chinese medicine. But that's the notion of it, right? So some lack of that sort of baseline of emotions, that lack of baseline of basic positive thinking, however that looks, then we would say it's the experience of depression is a lack of the clear yang of the spleen from rising into the mind. Then we go one step further and we say, okay, what are the things that could block this? And now we're in the world of pattern diagnosis. Right. So school is fantastic in terms of learning TCM. Schools are fantastic at teaching us the pattern diagnosis. But I don't find that a lot of practitioners necessarily think about it this way, kind of this two-tier system in a sense. And not every disease is open to this conjecture and this thought process, but I open the floor to this kind of discussion. So depression is a good example of this, let's say that. Okay, so we discussed then saying, like, look, liver qi stagnation isn't necessarily the cause of all depression. Now, of course, liver qi stagnation is a huge factor in a lot of the depression that you see in the United States because, it's just what it is, right? So this is clearly a big part of this, but we just to be clear that it's not the only way that we think about this. So, given that we think of this as being the lack of the clear yang of the spleen from rising into the mind. My old teacher, my kind of old mentor, who was the one that kind of taught me this stuff really, he had a treatment that he did for this, which was when I worked with him for him, he was typically doing two-sided treatments. So typically the back first, and then I would go in, pull the needles, flip them over, and get them ready for a front treatment. And the depression treatment kind of always went as follows, which is to say that on the back portion of the treatment, what he would do is he would kind of randomly pick like 4 or 5 dew points on the spine. And he would just sort of, just starting at the bottom and just kind of going up. He didn't do 1. I never saw that. But, starting at do 4 and, just kind of picking some random spots on the way up there. And then ultimately with do 20. And then what he would have me do is I would go in and I would do moxa on maybe the lowest 3 points, dew points on the back. He didn't generally have me do moxibustion on points that were like do 12 or do 20, any of these points, because sometimes that moxa on the upper body can lead to headaches and stuff like that. And there are instances where doing moxa on do 20 in adults could be possible, but in general, you know what I mean? Like you're gonna give headaches or insomnia or something to somebody. it's possible, right? So generally what we do is I would do moxon, do 4 and then do 8 and whatever it was, just a couple, maybe 3 points. And his notion of this was that what you were doing was you were filling the dumai with yang, and then that yang could rise into the mind. So you were sort of supporting that yang rising into the mind. And so then this was his treatment for this, and this was to treat the experience of depression. Let's just support the body's yang, whatever's going on, right? So whether this is liver qi stagnation, whether there's more yang deficiency here, whatever the case may be that's sort of blocking this yang from going upwards into the mind, or the lack of yang, let's just support the core physiology. Let's just support the core function of the body that should have the yang rising into the mind via the dumai. Right. So this then was sort of the treatment that everyone got when they sort of had that chief complaint of depression. Then what he'd do is be done with that, pull the needles, flip them over, and then on the front treatment, then he would get deeper into the pattern diagnosis, right? So all of the different things that we're used to thinking about vis-a-vis depression, all of those kind of sort of fancy type depression type things, then that's where then this would come out. Okay, so I sort of doing this to finish that conversation about depression. Last time the conversation went a little long, so, but here I want to say that this was his way of thinking about all of this. But then as I was kind of thinking about this, this is basically all I really wanted to say, was just to finish that conversation. But the more I was thinking about this conversation, then of course you start thinking about depression in the years that I've treated it, and kids and teens and adults and all of the different people that we've all seen with this. And I did start to think about this question of, well, are there situations where that kind of treatment on DO20 might be contraindicated? Maybe in manic depression, right? Sometimes with manic depression or bipolar disorder, the teachers are often kind of fond of saying like, well, in these cases, you don't want to overstimulate the qi, because they're all thinking that this is always liver qi stagnation. So you don't want to overstimulate the qi because you could spark a manic episode. And people who are saying that will usually have some story where it occurred to them. So now they're much more careful about it. And certainly this would be something to think about and something to worry about, right? So if somebody comes in with a diagnosis of bipolar, then, there might be, you might rethink this question of using that kind of moxibustion on DO20 and all that kind of thing, because you don't want to push them too hard into that situation, into the manic phase of that. But then, it makes me think about this question of bipolar disorder. What is it about bipolar disorder? Is it, again, teachers are often fond of saying, well, it's some more serious kind of liver qi stagnation, and then the liver qi stagnation, then when it moves, then all of this depressed fire can come out and move upwards. And that's what a lot of the teachers will say, though. To my mind, the more advanced discussion that I hear other practitioners say is that, in fact, you guys remember when we talked about ADHD, right? And I was saying that in the liver type, in the wood type ADHD, this is your classic kind of liver qi stagnation situation where, okay, a kid or an adult is frustrated, is irritable, is angry, and that kind of stuff. And in the kid's case, it's making them act out in class. They're a bit hyper, they're trying to get attention to move their qi and all this kind of stuff. And then we talked about the presence of phlegm in that situation, the presence of insubstantial phlegm in that situation. So we talked about the presence of insubstantial phlegm in, say, autism, and it produces a very specific set of symptoms in that case. The way that it presents in that case is very specific. But the way that it might present in an ADHD situation would be, at the lowest level, would just be in making the presentation look more severe, right? So this kid isn't just feisty. This kid is oppositional defiance disorder, right? So they've really moved into that realm. Right. So, or, and then we had that conversation where, well, then sometimes the presentation can get a little odd on you, right? So then we talked about, some presentations there, the kid might have auditory hallucinations. They might start saying things, that would perk up the ears of a psychiatrist, maybe. Where the kid otherwise just kind of has this ADHD diagnosis, but then they're starting to say things that a psychiatrist is like, it's a little odd, right? So that kind of thing is also indicative of this phlegm. So, on the one hand, the insubstantial phlegm in an ADHD situation creates an obstruction to the qi, which then makes the qi stagnation more severe, which then just makes the kid's general presentation look more severe. But then you get that sort of getting into the heart, getting into the mind, and it starts to produce a whole different set of symptoms, right? So here in this case, what's interesting, in the case of bipolar disorder, we would probably say that bipolar disorder really is representative of the presence of phlegm and damp. In fact, I mean, if you look at the sort of standard list of symptoms associated with unipolar, depression, just sort of general depressive state, versus bipolar disorder, the symptoms actually come out to be quite interesting, right? So like in standard depression, people will often describe themselves as sort of having hollow, feeling sort of empty or hollow, right? And this can be on the one hand sort of like a qi deficiency thing. They're kind of tired. But the hollow thing is an interesting description, because kids will describe this to me. And I see this in my liver type kids more typically. That kind of hollow experience is more indicative of like blood deficiency. Kids will describe this, and if you guys have ever had this experience yourself when you were kids or now or something, it's a rare thing to hear people talk about, but when you hear somebody talk about it and you've had this experience, it's undeniable, the experience of it, which is this sensation of being very small inside your body. You just lay there in your bed and you just feel very, very tiny, and you're inside this giant thing, and it's kind of this hollow space. And it's just a sensation. It's not a hallucination. It's just this sensation. You just feel it. You can't get it. Or they'll describe things like, I can hear my thoughts kind of shouting in my head, kind of in an empty space. As if somebody was yelling in an empty space, this kind of hollow, large hollow building or room or something like that. That people describe that, right? In Chinese medicine, sometimes in more traditional descriptions of this, they'll say things like people who dream of flying or floating. If you've ever had that dream, is more indicative of this blood deficiency. You sort of become a hot air balloon, sort of a dirigible or something like that, and you kind of float, So pleasant dreams of flying in Korean culture, they say, is a sign of good luck. You're going to pass your boards or something. But this more pathological dream of actually floating, that's like uncomfortable or not necessarily pleasant, then this would be a sign of this blood deficiency. All of these things. So people describe, they're tired and all these kinds of things. Okay, qi deficiency, fine, but this hollow sensation, people will describe, that's more kind of common in standard depression. Whereas in bipolar, very often the way people will describe their sensation of the physical sensation of bipolar is they will say they feel very heavy. The body feels physically weighted down. The limbs are very, very heavy, a very typical description of dampness. Right, this turbidity, this heaviness, it gets into the muscles, it gets into the meridians, and then holds things down. Right, so this is a more common description of bipolar. You don't tend to see this in kind of standard depression. Another example that I've seen frequently enough is like the difference in sleep. In kind of standard depression, the sleep tends to be more of a kind of almost kind of yin deficiency sort of quality very often, kind of that empty heat. right? So the lack of blood, the lack of yin, the lack of fluids to anchor the shen. So they're getting restless at night, anxiety, frequent waking at night, of course, then running hot, all the things that we know. But even things like early morning waking up at 3, waking up at 4, waking up and just being wide awake and can't go back to sleep, all of these being very typical in kind of yin deficiency, fluid deficiency states, right? Very, very common description in kind of more standard depressive states. Whereas in bipolar, a more common sort of descriptor here is actually sort of, rather than insomnia, is sort of, what do they call it? Like hypersomnia or somnolence, actually oversleeping. Right. So then they can, it's easy enough to fall asleep, but then they sleep for 10, 12, 14 hours and yet wake up tired. And then when they do wake up, they kind of feel groggy. They have trouble getting their head clear. They sort of take a hot shower and drink some coffee or something before they sort of, the head will clear, the body feels heavy. All of these things indicating this kind of phlegm and damp, right? And the phlegm and damp sort of suppresses the activity of the shen at night. We've had conversations about this, I think, about like bedwetting and different kinds of things, and the degree to which bedwetting could be related to the lack of the clear yang rising into the mind, and whether this is a pure sort of yang deficiency presentation or whether there's damp, right? Or more typically a combination of the two, of course. But this would be a somewhat more common description of bipolar type sleep where that phlegm and damp is present. Whereas more often in standard depression, it's typically more insomnia. Now, of course, there's a million people out there saying, well, I just have regular depression, but I do have hypersomnia. Well, that's fine. You most likely have phlegm and damp as a part of your presentation, right? So this would be then, this kind of thing. Or, another way, a descriptor that goes here is that the phlegm and damp sort of veils the mind, right? Veils that clear yang of the mind, the alertness of the mind, and creates that cloudiness, and it kind of traps the consciousness or something like that. It get kind of dark in there, right? So then the shen is kind of sort of smothered by that damp. And so the person can't sort of break through that veil. They kind of can't break through. It's like being in a steam room or something like that, like being in a really dense cloud or something. You break out of that, right? So even while sleeping, the shen is sort of smothered by the presence of this phlegm. So, however you want to look at it, this would be yet, I think, another argument that bipolar has a strong element of so-called phlegm and damp as a part of it. Another aspect of bipolar, it's more common in bipolar to see more kind of serious mental confusion issues, right? More dissociation type things, even hallucinations, visual, audio, those kinds of things. This would be a more common occurrence in bipolar than it would be in sort of standard depression. In standard depression, the mind is it's clear, right? But they're stuck. So they're stuck in some kind of sort of loop of just being like sort of stuck with sad thoughts, hopeless thoughts. Nothing. Just no matter how hard you try, nothing will ever work out. I had a kid describe this to me one time. He said, when I close my eyes and I lay in bed for a while, the mood will just hit me. He's like, it's as if there are bowling pins in the sky and I can never knock them down. And he just said it. He just was like, that's what it feels like. That's what I see when I get into that state. When I get into that depression, it's there. He just said there's just bowling pins. They're above my head, and it's almost like the fact that they're above his head, he'll never be able to clear the wick there, whatever they call it, sort of clear all those pins. It's just how it's just hopeless. And he feels, he's like, I just feel utterly hopeless. And he's like, I'm just stuck in that thought. I can't, he's like, I'm sitting here telling you this, and I know it sounds, not, it doesn't sound, it's like, this sounds insane, but he's like, but this is just how I experience it. Bowling pins, and I can't knock them down, and it's overwhelming for him. Right? So the mind in that sense is clear, but it's stuck. Right? Or it could be a frustration loop, just sort of stuck in that kind of frustration. But bipolar has this, but people with bipolar far more often, not far more often, are far more likely to report difficulty thinking. Whether that's like kind of what we were saying before, like this grogginess, kind of getting your head together, sort of getting your thought process together, or whether this is more kind of serious things, like, really like kind of more serious mental confusion, getting into the word salad thing, just can't, thinking but can't get your words out right, dissociation, of course, kind of, but all of these different things. This is much more commonly reported in bipolar than it is in just kind of standard depression. And again, for me, this would point to this dampness. Now, here, what we're talking about is really kind of phlegm misting the heart, phlegm misting the mind, veiling the heart. So this now gets right into that sort of thing, right? So this kind of false perceptions of reality or something like that, because it's like kind of clogged with this dampness. Another one that you see is statistically, depression is more just kind of a loss of appetite, for kind of forgetting to eat, whereas bipolar, it's much more sort of cravings for sweet, heavy, thick kind of dampening foods, carbs and dairy typically, sugar. And a lot more kind of emotional eating associated with that, which would, to me, indicate the presence of damp. But in this case, the dampness is sort of heating up the stomach, right? So now you're getting that kind of damp heat quality, right? Just you just kind of keep going through this. It's like physical movement. Standard depression is just kind of a lack of interest. Just don't want to move. The yang just isn't there. The will, just isn't that strong there. But bipolar kind of has a more, it can be difficulty moving. It can be kind of a slowing of physical movements. Right, the speech could be slower, thought processes are slower, physical movements are slower. I mean, in that sense, it can be more clumsy, more prone to accidents from slow reflexes. Right, this would be a really, statistically, is much more common in bipolar to see those kinds of things. Here, again, the dampness just slowing down the system, just kind of slowing everything down. Another reaction is, or another indicator, I think, to my mind, of dampness would be that bipolar typically has a worse reaction to the types of medications that typically get used for just kind of standard depression. And the description is typically the types of drugs, typical kind of drugs that get used, and it's almost kind of true across the different classes of drugs that get used in these situations. But the Western medications that get used for depression, according to Chinese medicine, kind of have this sort of acrid, sort of, in a sense, drying kind of acrid quality, and we would say, on the one hand, acrid is designed to move that stagnant qi. And yes, that is true, but don't forget also that acridity is also kind of drying. Right, so and some people will even say having a windy quality. I think I recall Bob Flaws saying that. And so it can actually very strongly affect bipolar disorder. They're much more prone to having side effects that can push them into kind of manic episodes, kind of into the manic phase, so rather than just lifting the depression. So now here, I'm not saying this is necessarily a super strong argument for the presence of dampness, because by itself, in theory, moving the qi too much, too fast can still, in a case of just pure qi stagnation, moving the qi too much, too fast can trigger, this kind of side effects, this kind of the roughness that chai hu is said to have when you overdose it and you don't add something like bai shao to kind of take the edge off of it. This could still be, I think, but the fact that it is drying like that, And it's not just that the person gets kind of hyper, because in a case of sort of standard depression where we're saying like, look, this lack of yang, very commonly it's this liver qi stagnation. And of course, with liver qi stagnation, most often you're going to have some amount of blood deficiency, fluid deficiency under the surface, that this kind of drying quality does produce this. And I've given the example of drinking too much coffee, right? So for blood deficiency types who drink too much coffee, they get that kind of hyperactive response. And that we could say that here in this case, yeah, this is true, that the person would have some kind of anxiety response, some kind of a little bit hyperactive response. But to get thrown completely into a manic phase, now this would be, I think, a whole different thing, right? So I think that this would be indicative of this kind of this phlegm and damp. So then the question becomes, okay, so what is it then in the case of kind of the manic phase? What we're sort of, or in bipolar disorder, what we're saying here generally is that in bipolar disorder, the depressive phase is kind of this cold phlegm, and it just kind of it holds the yang down, it stagnates the qi more, it just adds that extra element to what would be sort of considered sort of standard depression. Then the presence of phlegm and damp then just makes that more severe, and in some cases quite a bit more severe, in terms of bipolar, right? A more out and out bipolar diagnosis. So it just makes it more severe, and then kind of could add some different qualities to it. Then the thing is about phlegm and damp in the body is that we are creatures of yang, right? In the sense that like we are warm bodies. And so that if a person does in fact have a decent amount of yang, that they're not sort of true yang deficiency, the problem with phlegm and damp in the body is that it's my teacher had a funny kind of a way of saying this, like phlegm and damp is like a pile of oily rags in the garage. It's just sort of waiting for a little heat source then to turn into some huge thing. It just makes what existing heat you have and turns it into a much larger thing, right? But what's interesting about the phlegm and damp is it can kind of depress that heat. It can hold that heat in. We see this to some degree in autism, right? Because there's a lot of heat in autism, but it's kind of held in by the phlegm and damp, and it comes out and it's held in, and it comes out and it's held in. It kind of cycles back and forth. Well, don't we see this in bipolar disorder? I mean, by definition, that's what bipolar is a cycling of more heat and less heat. So what would be the notion here is that you have during the depressive phase this cold phlegm, but that eventually that heat, that phlegm and damp, it's leading to more heat under the surface. Right. So then the degree to which liver qi stagnation plays into all of this, this starts to be a question, right? But that phlegm and damp turns hot, and then that heat kind of flares upwards, right? So that heat kind of flares upwards. Then you get that longer kind of prolonged manic phase, right? Because it's almost like in that case, then the phlegm and damp sort of acts as fuel for the heat. Because in the case of depression, you can be somewhat frustrated and irritable, and that frustration coming out, that's the degree to which people who are depressed can also just kind of be frustrated. That lashing out is the qi stagnation leading to liver heat, and then the qi moves, and then the person kind of lashes out, and then they kind of go back and forth. They kind of cycle between that in a typical liver way. Things with cycles typically point to the liver. So you go kind of back and forth on that. They kind of go back and forth on this depressive / frustrated and angry, depressive, frustrated, going back and forth to some degree. And this could cycle, through the day, through weeks, through months, and how long it lasts. But the bipolar, the manic phase is much more severe. It lasts for a longer period of time, and it's just way more intense. And this kind of points us back to this presence of phlegm and damp question, making it more severe. And then it ultimately provides the fuel for this. Where you also see this depressed heat from damp come up is in Down syndrome. I don't know if I remember describing this to you guys. Maybe we can unpack Down syndrome next time. But Down syndrome has a lot of damp associated with it. And when you start to treat Down syndrome kids and you start to clear that dampness out, they can get pretty feisty on you. Which is kind of disconcerting for the parents, because at first they're like, oh wow, my kid is talking more, their IQ went up, right? So they're talking more, they're doing more activities of daily living for themselves, more independence, all these things. But then this feistiness starts to come out, and a lot of that is that sort of depressed liver heat that was kind of held down by that dampness, because by and large, you know Down syndrome kids are just as sweet as you could want any human to be. They're having more fun than anyone. They're kind of living their dream in a way. So, you ever hang out with Down syndrome people, I mean, by and large, very happy, agreeable, very earth types, right? Very, very strong kind of archetypes of earth in that sense. But you start clearing up that damp, and they start getting a little more feisty on you. And the parents are like, "Well, we like the independence part, but we're not sure if the feistiness is that bad? Is that?" And you're like, "Well, it's just kind of part of what it is. You want your kid to be more independent. Well, they sort of almost have to go through this developmental phase of that independence, kind of fighting for independence, that feistiness. This is part of the independence." And always when I describe it to the parents that way, they immediately are like, "Oh." Okay, yeah, okay, cool. Like, it makes sense to them. And they're like, oh yeah, this is great. Okay, fine. But this would be an example of kind of the dampness, which these Down syndrome kids have just so much of. And a big part of the treatment in Down syndrome is clearing that dampness. And as you clear that dampness, this depressed heat comes out. Right? It's just an example of this. What's amazing about it is you don't see it, a lot of the times you don't see it at all in Down syndrome. It's just not there. I mean, they can be feisty, but a lot of the times it's just you didn't see it, and then suddenly it comes out when you start clearing that damp. Okay. So then this is this very sort of general conversation about what constitutes sort of bipolar and why bipolar is different from, sort of standard depression. The relationship of this phlegm and damp, the relationship of qi stagnation and ultimately blood deficiency in all of this, it presents two very different presentations. Where the standard depression is that yang deficiency underneath in the mind, but then, most typically in Western culture, we're seeing a lot of this liver qi stagnation with a lot of blood deficiency underneath. Whereas bipolar, then, true bipolar really has a lot more of this phlegm and damp. And of course, this is a spectrum, right? So it's everything in between. So again, it's kind of similar to ADHD, where you're looking at standard ADHD symptoms, we're looking at standard depression symptoms, and then you're starting to say to yourself, is there phlegm and damp here? So how do I determine that? The pulse is a good one, right? The slippery pulse, which we've talked about before, how to determine the slippery pulse. You'd be looking at the tongue. It's a thicker, all of the things that we normally associate with that turbidity. In the manic phase, that often that tongue switches to a true kind of damp heat tongue, right? Almost kind of like a Wendan tongue kind of presentation, right? In a certain sense, depending. So, pulse, tongue, and then the different descriptors that we gave before, these different symptoms that we talked about before, right? So these are, right? So you have, in terms of this being a spectrum, you get things like the hypomania, the difference between just, being frustrated and angry versus being depressed, versus then, the spectrum to which it glides into hypomania and then glides into full-blown mania. Right? So it's just less severe, right? So this kind of spectrum of things. So these are all the things that we'd be looking for. Now, a lot of the times, this is what gets tricky about this, is especially in bipolar, is that, it's rare to see an adult that isn't medicated, for more serious bipolar or even medium to mild. So then you're having to kind of parse out pulses and these kinds of things. And the presence of this, because you're sort of trying to figure out, well, what do I treat here? Most people just be like, you just treat what you see. Whatever the pulse is telling you, this is what you treat. But with a mind towards, is there dampness under the surface here? Are the drugs suppressing that to some degree? Are they sort of clearing that dampness to some degree? And typically those phlegm and damp symptoms will still be there with the medications, and you look at their response to the medication. That tells you what's going on under the surface. So you treat what you see, but with a mind towards, well, what, a lot of the times the questioning here is like, well, as much as you can is to get a sense of what were things like before medication. And a lot of times it's helpful to have other people in the room who knew them before and after. This is where treating kids is very useful, because a lot of the times I'm catching these kids in the early stages of this. A lot of the times bipolar is actually diagnosed earlier, like in the early 20s, late teens, early 20s, where more standard depression is sort of comes later. I don't necessarily know how to think about that one. These kinds of more serious dampness disorders, they do strike me, because they're more serious, they do strike me as something that's been around for a lot longer, right? So probably this phlegm and damp that began really in childhood, and all, it brings up more questions than it answers. But whereas maybe standard depression, it sort of takes time to get rolling as life sort of gets at you. But that being said, I mean, I've treated a ton of depressed kids, in their early teens, mid-teens, late teens, boys, girls, the whole thing. So I am catching these kids kind of early in the phases a lot of times before they're being medicated. So if I'm lucky, So, anyways, these are these discussions. So I think that the question here is about the fear of inducing a manic phase. Let's kind of finish on thinking about this induction of the manic phases. It does happen. Is it easy for it to happen? I'm not sure that it's so easy, but I mean, most practitioners have that story, if you've been around long enough. And so you do want to be mindful of these things. You don't want to give herbs that are overly drying. You don't want to give herbs that are overly, qi regulating. But you also don't necessarily want to give a bunch of herbs that are yang tonifying or something, So you got to tread a little bit carefully. So what you're doing as a part of your pattern diagnosis is you're saying like, look, okay, so I know what the core thing is here with the depressive side of things, with the yang deficiency. But the person may not show a lot of yang deficiency per se, maybe. Although the yang deficiency is implied in the set of symptoms, right? There's just tired all the time, a lot of the times, and just not moving, and these can not motivated. It's a yang deficiency. Then you're looking at the degree to which the pulse is then wiry, let's say. So that can tell you something about how much qi stagnation there is. So if the person seems yang deficient and yet the pulse is quite wiry, then you're going to want to move qi. But, you might want to be mindful, just be conservative in your herb choices, be conservative in your treatments a little bit. Just in case, depending on how much frustration the person you're thinking about triggering, is it likely that you're going to trigger something? No, not really. But it always pays to be conservative. Then the degree to which, looking at the tongue, is it dusky versus more damp looking? Is the pulse feeling slippery? Then these are going to start to be the indicators of the dampness being present in the case, whatever the diagnosis they come in with. I almost don't care what the diagnosis in that sense. These are the things that I'm looking for, right? So the degree to which there is yang deficiency, kind of just true yang deficiency, the degree to which there is liver stagnation, the degree to which there is dampness here. And the symptoms, as we listed them before, will be very telling about this as well. If your pulse diagnosis isn't so great, the symptoms will tell you everything, most things, okay? So this is how I'm thinking about this. I think a lot of the times the part of the discussion I don't hear in treating depression, especially bipolar, is this question of damp. So the degree to which dampness is present, and it's the same conversation we had about ADHD. When I talk to practitioners, when I teach and I talk to practitioners telling them about ADHD, look, this isn't just liver qi stagnation with how much heat is there, how much liver qi stagnation is there. You've got to be looking for the presence of damp. And the same goes for depression. Yang deficiency, liver qi stagnation. Where's the dampness? Is it there? These are the things that I'm looking for. All right, guys, take it easy. As always, some of you have reached out to me. More of you should reach out to me. It keeps me motivated to do these things a bit more. If you have ideas or things that you want to hear, I very much would enjoy interacting with you guys a bit more. But in the meantime, Take it easy, guys. Talk soon. Okay.